Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Dynamis pod. Today I'm joined by Mr. David Macholz of AVTECC.org. David, if you would, take it away.
Right. Thanks, Robert. Dave Macholz, and been in the automotive industry, as we were discussing earlier, for about, the better part of my adult life, but started real young in the field. I was 15 at a gas station, but that was inspired by my grandfather who worked for Snap-on Tools. And so I grew up around tools, cars, fell in love with the 64 and a half Mustang convertible that was in my grandfather's garage. It didn't run. And
hmm
just really got fascinated with the automobile. Fast forward to 2009, after completing my bachelor's degree in music, of all things, which I worked through working at independent repair shops and whatnot. I got into teaching accidentally. And over the course of the next 17, yes, about 17 years now, worked at the secondary level, at the post-secondary level as an instructor, was a T10 instructor at the post-secondary level, also Honda Pact. And then,
Very nice.
and then got promoted to department chair. And that was at Suffolk County Community College here where I live on Long Island, New York. And from there, decided if I was going to stay in administration, I probably should seek some higher education. So I went for my master's degree, Master of Arts in Higher Education Administration from Stony Brook University here on Long Island. And then subsequently thereafter, I started looking at doctoral programs. And I started the doctoral program at Old Dominion University, where I am
All right.
continuing my doctoral studies now. And my doctoral research is in automotive certification and the relationship between certification and earnings. So
Very
more or
nice.
less, yeah. What I was interested in looking at was, having lived through that secondary, post-secondary instructor, administrator piece, was how do we make the industry better for technicians? Specifically, right? Everybody looks
Certainly.
out for the industry, but I feel like we don't do a good enough job of saying what's good for technicians. So ultimately, wanted to understand, if certification was that pathway, how do we strengthen it? Which is contrary to probably what a lot of people think, when they hear about AvTech. But I believe in professionalization and obviously I believe in education. And I think we can do a better job at preparing our young people and folks that are coming into this industry with really good quality education, with the experiences that they need to be successful, and ultimately with a professional model that serves them well. And when I say serves them well, helps them move up, right? We see a
Sure.
lot of people leaving the industry. My doctoral research, you're talking 50, 60, 80% attrition in the first 2 to 5 years, depending on who you ask. And that to me is, not a technician shortage. It's a technician attrition problem, which means we have things
Certainly.
to fix and address. So, not that I didn't have enough to do, but in the midst of my doctoral studies and raising a young family, I knew that I wanted to create an organization that was going to address some of these needs. And I knew that given my unique qualifications, there's not many people that have been technicians, instructors, administrators, turned doctoral researchers, and was a graduate fellow in community career and technical education and research with Old Dominion University as well. So I knew that I had sort of a imperative, moral imperative to the industry, so to speak, to say how do we
Sure.
make this a better place for technicians, and that's what birthed AvTech. And
Very nice.
AvTech, yeah, and it was exciting and scary as hell, as you might imagine, to start a new organization. I've been involved with 501c3s, through my relationship with the college and different organizations that we worked with, Toyota T10 being one of the organizations that had a 501c3 that I was a board member of. But yeah, starting a 501c3 from scratch, putting a board together, trying to find some funding, right? And ultimately trying to put the underpinnings of this together has been a multi-year project. We started in 2024. And here we are in July of 2026, 2 years later, and continuing that work and excited for what lies ahead.
Sure. So one of the things that you mentioned that I want to kind of touch back on was basically how do we make it better for the technician? And that attrition rate should really ring a lot of alarm bells for a lot of people in the industry, I feel. And I've lived that. I've kind of watched that. You see a young guy come in and they get either burnt out or they don't learn quickly enough and then they get let go, or they just say, you know what, this isn't for me. They've had bad experiences with management possibly, and then they move on. So, in your estimation, because you have studied this for a really, really long time, where are some areas that we can be, especially after they leave, say they leave school, say they've went to a secondary school and now they're leaving, they're going into the industry. What's a couple things that you can touch on that maybe management can do and maybe something that the technician can do?
Yeah, no, great question. Initially, one of the reasons for the study that I chose for my dissertation was to understand sort of the earnings piece, right? Uh, when
Certainly.
I was at Suffolk, we had students that were out in work-based learning. And when I left there, it'll be 2 years ago in September, the average rate of pay of our students in work-based learning was 16.75 an hour. Right. So you're saying, okay, well, that's just a little bit better than minimum wage. Right. Some of those students, when you think about it, were 4 years into their education because they completed 2 years in high school. They completed 2 years of community college, some with factory certs, some with
Yes,
ASEs, some with a lot of ASEs, and 1675 was the average. So to me, that is number one. How do you get that entry level wage close to a living wage? And the living wage statistics are kind of scary now when you look at them.
definitely.
I was recently doing this. I just resubmitted my dissertation to my committee chair last
Hmm.
week, and I had to make some cost of living adjustments to Georgetown University has basically a metric of what a good job is. And a
Hmm.
good job,
Sure.
roughly, don't hold me to this exact number because I don't have it pulled up here in front of me, but a good job is one that supports a family and sustaining wage, but realistically, it's also for like one person. That number nationally,
Can I
what do you
guess?
think it's yeah,
3650.
hourly?
Yes.
So let's see what that transfers to, right? 3650 times 40 times, let's say 52. Yeah.
Should be close to
You're just about right
78,
on.
76,000.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in
I
contrast,
tell people a lot, like if you don't make $30 an hour right now going out into the industry, like it's almost like you have to have a roommate still. Like you leave school and then you may still have to have a roommate.
yeah, without question. I mean, my family, extended family was in town for 4th of July weekend, and my wife sent me to the grocery store for cold cuts, and it was
Sure.
21.99 a pound for roast beef, right? And for a pound of
Yeah.
roast beef, what do you make with that? 3 sandwiches?
Easily.
So
That's about it.
just for lunch, right? Like the cost to survive, even when you're packing your lunch and brown bagging it, like most of us were as technicians, you're spending a lot of money. So I think the first thing that needs to happen is the entry level pay has to go up. And not just because like the automotive industry is behind, but because also the students that we have that are entering, and when I say students, I'm speaking to this as a former educator, but career entrants in general. I mean, if they have any type of skill that's technical, there are so many different avenues that they can take. Why are they going to take ours? Right? They're
That's
stepping
exactly right.
into a BMW environment like you're in with $150,000 cars, and
Absolutely.
they may have barely driven, right? So one of the things that really kind of sticks out to me, and I heard this in your conversation with Ryan Ransom, right, from the ASE Facebook group, was the idea of master technician. And I
Sure.
don't like that term, especially associated with the educational process, because I think
Right.
what happens is you get what I call in my dissertation this really credential disappointment gap, right?
Hmm.
In which,
I believe that.
yeah, think about it. A young person goes in and says, I graduated such and such program that was a master automotive, certified program, whatever, mast. The employer goes, great. So the employer's expectation immediately shifts to the things that a master automotive certified, service technician would be capable of doing. So the big issue
Exactly.
there is now you've got this disappointment. The student thinks they've been prepared to work on the job. The employer thinks that the student's been prepared for that young person to work on the job. And there's this disappointment when they realize that they may or may not have the technical skills to actually function even in an entry level role. So that to me is the number one thing that we need to fix. And the biggest onus behind AVTECC is how do we improve the educational model, which really is the professional model of what an automotive technician is, by giving them training that results in the skills that they need to be successful at work.
Sure.
And I
Yeah,
think
and
that
it's not it's like a multivariant problem too. It's like it's not just maybe one thing. There's multiple pieces to that pie.
there are, so one of them is, you I've become in the process of writing my dissertation a historian of the automotive profession. And if you go back to where this started in the late 60s, early 70s, there was a competency problem that had come up as a result of congressional hearings. Ralph Nader was behind this. He had written a book called Unsafe at Any Speed. Um,
Unsafe at any speed. Yep. Corvair. Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking
that's
about.
exactly right. There was the Corvair, and there were other things, radial tires,
Hmm.
steering columns, seat belts, right? All of that became NHTSA. And ironically, Ralph Nader had been, during that process of writing that book, followed around by some investigators that were hired by General Motors. And I don't know if you've ever heard that before, but it was
I've not.
like,
That's new to me.
yeah. Now, if you look back at the history of it, it's quite interesting. And that GM actually admitted it in front of Congress. Nader sued them to the tune of about $400,000 and got the money that he needed to continue. And he was a lawyer. He was a private citizen. He didn't work for anyone. He was hired as a consultant by a senator that wanted to look into some of this. And that turned
Hmm.
into all sorts of different hearings on the automotive industry, one of them being what they called the automotive, called the whole thing the automotive problem. But that
I
turned
got you.
into a referendum on technician competence.
Okay.
So at that point in time, it's really super interesting. Uh, Part of what happened at that time was there was a few states and a few senators that got behind the idea of the airline industry and airline technicians having a professional model that included a license. Well, that license term rattled a lot of people, right? Because when you talk about a license, you're talking about restricting a trade. You're talking about maybe people that can't come in. You're talking about historically, there have been no professional standards. So, how would you even license? You're going to have to grandfather people. So, what happened
Certainly.
was NADA primarily and some other industry groups got together and they said, well, we don't want licensing, right? Because licensing would have done those things. And when you restrict the trade, you inherently increase wages.
Yeah, you're
So,
throwing a barrier to entry there. Absolutely.
yes, so what happened from there was that that group got together, those original founding members, NADA being a big player in that, and funded the creation of the National Institute for Automotive Service Excellence. So,
Interesting.
yeah, so that was the beginning of any type of true profession that we've had in the industry. It quickly,
I
because of
see.
all the funding they got, and because of the backing by the dealers, became one of the most, not just in the automotive industry, but in general, one of the most successful certification programs ever, right? Millions of people certified through the ASE program. So you have to
Sure.
give the credit where the credit's due. That's amazing.
Yeah. And they've been up since 1972, right?
72. Yeah.
Yeah. That's what I
So
thought.
in the process of, okay, well, what is this certification of competency going to look like? There's some historical documents that talk about the conversation being, well, you can't just, give everybody a test. You have to have some sort of performance piece.
Yeah. Some component. Sure.
which makes sense, right? I think it makes sense to us now as much as it did then. And this is very much why we find ourselves back to this conversation, I think, because it was very difficult for members of Congress, other folks within the industry to wrap their head around how they would take a performance based exam and conduct that at scale. There were no schools, there was no internet, right? So there were a lot of barriers to being able to do that. So simultaneous to that conversation, there was a PhD out of Princeton University in New Jersey. His name was Dr. Benjamin Schimberg. He had written a lot of peer reviewed journal articles on licensing
I
and
got you.
voluntary certification as a better pathway than licensing. And yes, you're not going to fix all these ills of, incompetence in total, but you have a standard, it's scalable, everybody takes the same test. Schimberg was one of the founders of an organization out of New Jersey at that time called Educational Testing Services. They were
Okay.
actually in the news just last week because they bought ACT. So ETS is
Okay.
famous for college entrance exams, SATs. ACT was their competitor. They just bought them. They're a
Nice.
nonprofit. They're not nonprofit organization that does testing in general. So they convinced the powers that be, and they probably didn't take very much convincing because there was no real way to scale performance-based testing at that time.
Sure.
But they
There's kind of
they
a
made
vacuum there too. Like
yeah,
there's
there's
nothing, like you were saying.
nothing, right? There was no formalized education, anything. So it made a lot of sense to start there. And I think they started with 4 program areas and they kind of built it out as they went along. Some 7 years later, they went back to Congress. And one of the questions that came up yet again, I actually have a book here sitting on my desk that are all the historical records of these conversations. So I'm speaking to this from, knowledge from the research that I've done.
Sure.
But there were
Having have read it.
questions.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, after 7 years, ASC had investments of over $7,000,000. If you think about that in 1970s dollars, that's a ton of money.
Yeah.
Majority of which came
You're
from NADA.
you're high 3-digit millions at this point,
It
the
it
way
would
that inflation
absolutely
is.
be. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
ASE's ties to the industry, new car dealerships, manufacturers go back to the beginning. So from that perspective, they reported on how many technicians. I think they had 175,000 technicians at that time already certified. But you think about it, a 7-year period is incredible, right? Because this was paper-based tests. You're mailing these
Yeah.
out. I mean, now
I remember
way
when I
back
took my
then.
first one, mine was on paper out of college. Yeah.
Right. So they had to put that whole thing together, and it looked nothing like it does today, right? With the computer-based testing in the center, I'm sure it was probably archaic compared to what it is now, but that was unheard of at that time. So
Mhm.
the other thing that came up in 1978 was again the question of how on earth does a multiple choice certification sort out those that are competent versus those that are not? And there's multiple testimonies from different folks throughout the industry, throughout Congress, who continue to ask that question. And at that point in time, they said, well, what would you have us do? It's still not feasible. So, fast forward a few years to about 1985, which was 7 or 8 years after those hearings. uh, ASE realized they needed to have educational standards. They founded the National Automotive Technicians Education Foundation, NATEF, right,
Okay.
which we knew it at that time. And that was the first time that we ever saw accreditation standards or program standards for what
Sure.
education should look like at the secondary and post secondary level.
Now, is that
So
close to the time that they started the ETLs and going around doing the accreditation to the schools?
that's exactly right. So
Okay.
85 was the first that happened. And
I see.
it wasn't a perfect model, but if you look back to some of those original documents, it's darn near identical to what's there today, with the exception of a few things, but it's very, very similar to what they came out with in '85.
I got to shadow and do ETL work while I was out in Wyoming. So I
Okay.
got to see kind of the inside of, how the sausage is made, and it's a fairly, it's a good process. They
It
take
is.
somebody like yourself that's been in for a really long time, and they know what they're looking for. They go in, they check the curriculum, they check the tools and how many things that are there per student, make sure things are, the way that they're supposed to be, and sign off on it and leave. So it's
That's right.
it's definitely a good system how they do it.
It is, and it was one of the first in career and technical education. There's actually studies that have been written about it, and there's some validation studies that were done in order to make it a national standard that had a relatively small sample size because you didn't have that many accredited
Sure.
schools at that point. And then so that's where sort of this whole like, well, what does automotive education look like? Come from. So the logical thing at that point was to use, and you've seen for the ASE exams, I know you were talking about them with Ryan yesterday, a
Yeah,
job task analysis, right?
exactly.
So ETS, who develops standardized tests, that is an industry standard for the design of certification for personnel. So there's two frameworks for that, but to save you the gritty details, basically you create a job task analysis to come up with the knowledge, skills, and abilities required to do the job. And ASC had done those in those content areas that, as you guys were discussing on your last podcast, the A1 through the A8 were really the core eight, and they've obviously done other tests other than that. But all
Yeah.
of our automotive education, as you're very aware, stems from those task lists. So
Yes.
secondary, post-secondary, right? They might do different percentages of them, but there's sometimes repetition of the tests and whatnot. So all of
Exactly.
this to say, right? Why have we done things the way that we've done? How do we get to sort of this disappointment gap, right? In my opinion, in 1972, and this really is an opinion, but cars were way more simple than they are today. Right?
Absolutely.
Take, for example, electricity and electronics. And I was just playing with this with AI yesterday, by the way. So if you look at the task list, I think there's 52, 53, 54 items on the A6 task list, right?
Sure.
And
I
we
believe
say, well,
that. Yeah.
so you say, well, there's no way that there's only 54 cognitive pieces to this, right? And when I say cognitive pieces, like when we talk about learning, a student comes in and they learn something in chunks, right? Or these
Yes.
cognitive elements, right? And those
Yep.
cognitive elements, you might think of them as, okay, well, if we're talking about a brake system, right? If I had to diagnose a brake pulsation concern, right, or diagnose a brake concern, right? Wow,
Yes.
right? That now is not one task. That's
No.
probably 30, 40, 50 different cognitive elements, right? So in 1972, I actually looked today. I said, I went back to the earliest task list that I could find. It was 1993, I believe. There were
Okay.
40, 42. I think there were 12 less tasks than there are today.
Sure. I
So,
could see that.
couple immediate things come to mind, right? Like, okay, how in that amount of time we went from no computer controls, right? We went from non-electronic ignition, minimum emissions controls, but even just on the
Yeah.
electrical side, right? We had very basic electrical systems on cars in 1972, right?
Yeah. I mean,
So,
electric ignition would be like a dual point system at that point,
right.
or
So
the
if you
beginning of transistors. That was pretty much it.
That's right. And if you look at the amount of tasks on the overall mass list, it's about 405,
Hmm.
right? So you take
That's a
that
lot.
405, which is a lot to begin with, but then you use that cognitive multiplier. You're talking about thousands of individual pieces of knowledge that are required for a student to assemble to be able to A, just regurgitate that back to you for one, but B, they've got to assemble it and they've got to use it. So I think
Exactly.
what's happened, in automotive education, from my estimation, in the last 50 years, is you've seen a dramatic change in the automobile,
Yes.
and you've seen a dramatic change in the amount of content that needs to be covered by an automotive program. And
Yes.
what's happening is, and by no fault of the instructors, but you're seeing some of this feedback on, Wrenchway did a whole survey of the automotive industry. And one of the things that you saw come back was the perception that educational institutions are teaching outdated curriculum and whatever they might, yeah, whatever the feedback might be. But I think that the real reason for that, Robert, is the fact that educators are buried, right?
Sure.
You have,
Yeah.
yeah, the other, what I mean by buried is you have too much content to teach and the time allotted to teach it. The other piece that's changed significantly over the last 50 years was when I was a kid, 1980s, right? A 65 Mustang was 15, 20 years old, right? Car was relatively simple. It was also accessible. My grandfather had the Snap-on truck, so he had all the tools in the garage, and we worked on that car together and knew what every tool in that toolbox was because I asked grandpa and he said, "Oh, that's, whatever it was." I was at a school recently, an advisory board, and we were talking about students today coming into the industry. And the students today coming in the industry may not have a car. Their family may not have a car, depending on the urban environments they might live. And if that's the case, they probably have never opened a hood, but they may not even have a toolbox. So
That's true as well.
yeah, and that's huge. So when you think about the fact that the student has changed
Hmm.
and the amount of material that's required for the automotive technician to know, that's also changed, has led
Yes.
to, I think, outcomes from schools that are mixed, right? You have some schools
Yeah.
that are doing an amazing job because maybe they have a good feeder program that's really nicely articulated. But I think you still have, and I lived it, I was an instructor. You have a lot of instructors that are overwhelmed because they're trying to teach this content to their student population that may not have the context. Right? Like, I've
Certainly.
always said, like, if I could have had 5 years in the industry before I had any type of automotive education and lived that for 5 years and then taken it, my whole contextual shift, right, would have happened there, and, like, I would have learned it much faster. And I
Yeah.
think
And
that's
you get to see that too, because like there are still some students who you can say that they have a natural gift, or you can say that they've had the grandfather, they've had the dad that showed them a lot of this stuff. They come through the program sometimes and they actually look bored. So there is a huge mix, like you're saying, because like one of the things that you have to do is you got to be able to pivot some way to be able to teach all the way from the lowest student in the class as far as skill level all the way to the highest. And that can be challenging sometimes.
oh, you're absolutely right, and I think, the biggest challenge is for the teacher, right? So you've got all this material, right?
Yes.
Because we're thinking we have to get this student through this 1,200-hour voluminous amount of content, the 405
Yeah.
tasks, and I understand
Entire
there's
program.
percentages, right? And what are we going to get out of the other end of that? So what happens is, in my estimation, is your content deep and your skills shallow. You add to that now that, the students don't have that hands-on knowledge before they step into our classrooms. So the perception of education is from the industry, and it's the wrong, well, the perception is their perception, right? But it's misguided, misunderstood, is that we're not doing a good job in
Certainly.
education. But the reality is all those things have changed, and the model to which we're delivering instruction, and the model to which we're validating whether or not students can do this work, right, hasn't really changed. So that's where I see AVTECC coming into that. But you mentioned a really other important part to this too is the teacher. I'm not sure how long you were in the industry. I know for a number of years, right, before you became an instructor.
28, 28
28.
as a technician, made master, and then got L1 and L3 recently, but that was while I was an instructor. But I've been instructing now for almost 4 years going on.
Yeah.
So,
So the
but I was in for a long time. I got to see both sides of the counter. So I was a service the director for Jag and Rover for a while. I worked with a lot of different luxury brands because I was at Volkswagen, and you watch just inundated on a Saturday, 23, 24 cars, and you're one advisor because I moved from tech to advisor at that point, and then I have one backup guy. So you're writing 22 or 24 cars almost by yourself. And then like you look at hours per RO as opposed to how many ROs, and I'm like, Audi's up the road, and Audi only wants you to work on 8 to 12 cars a day, and really you should have 8 a day, and that way whatever carryover, that extra 3 or 4, you're just dealing with the customer from the day before. So like it's a lot, right? And I think it helps me translate into the instructor shoes, if you will, because it does help me be able to try to like, okay, you get to see these threats, right? Like SWOT, like you get to see these threats out there and assess what's happening in the classroom and kind of being able to kind of keep your eyes on the whole thing. So it definitely helps, but
Yeah, it's 20 years is or 28 years rather is a
yeah,
rarity, right? For someone with
yes,
28 years of experience to enter the classroom, the instructor usually has to be talking about a life change like, "Hey, my body's tired, I've had enough."
certainly
Right? And typically what happens, at least that I've experienced, and I've hired a number of instructors over the years and been on committees and put together job descriptions and things like that. You either get a Robert that has 28 years of experience, and I would guess, Robert, correct me if I'm wrong, did you have any type of classes that taught you how to teach before you started teaching?
0. The only thing I had was a team lead at Volkswagen, and I had, some jobs where I was foreman or service manager in one way, shape, or form. You were never called that, but when someone didn't understand at the counter how to sell something, I was the person that they came and got, if you will. So, but no, not formally, not anything to be able to share. Now, luckily for the students, like, I learned organizational psychology. Like I read a ton of books. I learned how to speak publicly. I learned body position, body language, intonation, inflection, how to get someone's attention in the classroom or, in the world. I learned those things before I ever went really into management
That's
because if you're
fantastic.
going to go into management, you have to know those things to be successful. So I kind of learned those things before I ever got to the classroom, which is the reason why I ended up doing well at instructor because when I went to go do a micro teach for a school, like I had people leave and come up to me and tell me, I've never seen anybody teach like that. Like I really liked what you taught me and I learned what you were telling me. And I'm like, okay, I really appreciate
Awesome.
that. Yeah. So you're
Yeah.
right. I mean, I think you're going to say you either get someone like me or you get someone that's got 3 to 5 years in the industry that maybe can teach but don't have the industry experience behind them. There's not like a happy medium anywhere. Is that where you're going with that?
Yeah, and I think
I could
there's a
see
number.
that.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple reasons for that. For one, um, I know a big area for career and technical education research right now is sort of an undocumented career and technical education instructor shortage.
Mhm.
And when you have an
Sure.
instructor shortage, the other thing that happens is a lot of the CTE administrators, if they were not really solid instructors, are now administrators of programs that, are making decisions about what these programs look like. So that's an issue in and of itself, but that's also something one of the things that we're trying to address with AVTECC. It's really, really hard to think that someone with 3 years of experience is going to have the requisite knowledge that's deep enough to teach a really good engine performance class or advanced diagnostics class, let's say. Just haven't lived it. You haven't had the context. So there
That's
needs to be,
100% accurate.
yeah, and there needs to be some level of continual development that goes beyond just attending webinars. Not that that's not important, you know. I think
Certainly.
any type of education that you can grab is, but
Yes.
meaningful educational experiences that are, designed with objectives and they're assessed, right? To make sure that individuals that come through those training programs have the requisite knowledge, skills, and abilities to be able to take that information forward and now impart that to somebody else. So all of this works together, to where the current educational model is today, where, I think the current educational model is going to face some threats.
Mhm.
One being you're hearing a lot about apprenticeship in the news, right? Not that that can't work with education, but it has to be very very intentionally designed to work. You're also hearing things about dealerships creating their own training programs that I think to some extent are the result of them not having good experiences with schools or
Certainly.
not having a school in their area. But that becomes attractive to employers because now they can do a couple of things. They can bring young people in, they can sign them to a contract. They can say, "You're gonna be with us for 5 years, and here's the 5-year plan or the 3-year plan, and here's where your incremental advances are, but you have to perform to X, Y, and Z level." So you're seeing a lot of it. There's quite a number of from what I understand, there's 20 groups now exploring this, in dealership model. And what makes me nervous about that is we have a lot of institutions out there that are well equipped with
Yeah.
instructors like Robert Stage, right? That are bringing it, and can do an incredible job. And I see those as threats, to where we are.
Yeah.
AI,
One thing that pops up, just to stop you real quick, one thing
yeah,
that pops up in my mind too with those little apprenticeship things, I'm not sure that that is always the best for the student slash new technician. Because like you were saying with contractual obligations, you get enter into something, no matter if you had an attorney look at it or not. Like if you really want the job, you're going to sign up. But like on the backside of that, say they make you stay hourly for 3 years. So like my thing is like I had a good process. So I had a good experience because I was in a good system when I worked flat rate. So that's not everybody's experience. And I'm sympathetic to that plight. But like, if someone gets good enough and they can beat those 40 hours every week and they're pretty consistent, like for me personally, it's like let them do the hybrid style pair, let them do the full on, you know, piecework, let them do, you get to keep what you kill, that type of thing, in the industry. Cause like there's no stopping somebody like that. And
yeah.
really, I hate the glass ceiling component that it could, I'm not throwing shade at anybody, but it could happen in those types of apprentice programs. But you were mentioning AI, I'm sorry.
No, no, just to go back to apprenticeship for a minute too. I mean, I think
Mhm.
that's a very relevant conversation. You probably saw last week that
Yes.
Department of Labor gave ASE $25 million to support
Just
apprenticeships.
there's money being handed out everywhere at this point because I mean, really, it's to me, it is a national security threat. I don't know if you'd seen or if you're in the podcast group. Like I posted one of the micro posts that was like, it's actually a national security threat, and it actually is. So I believe
Yes.
that wholeheartedly. So like, there's
Yeah.
a full court press that has to be done now, and I have no issue with losing a couple students to an apprenticeship program if it fixes the problem. I have tons of students that are coming my direction that, it's a popular program and we do a great job with it. So it's like, I get that. But like you said, I mean, 25 million here, Wells Fargo gave Micro 10 million. Now he's partnered with Meta, Facebook. So more money. I think there was $100 million that was given to his, might have been 10 as well, but a lot of money, like you were
Yeah,
saying.
it's a ton. I mean, just this week, the 25 million that was awarded by the Department of Labor was awarded to ASE to set up 6,000 apprenticeships over the next 4 years. So basically
Yeah.
1,500 a year. We do the math on
Yeah.
that for a second, right? If you're talking 30 apprentices a week, that's a lot,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
6,000 doesn't seem like a huge number, but that's a lot of people to enroll. The caveat here is they have to be in a registered apprenticeship, right? Not just like, "Hey, I have an apprenticeship at my shop and students can come
Yeah.
work
They
with me." No, it's
swung
not that.
by and they were hanging out at the shop. They actually have to be like on paper.
Formalized registered apprenticeship, most of which are done at the state level. The one that ASE is sort of behind is the one that's in partnership with NADA. That's a 1.5 to 2 year apprenticeship. I believe it's 2,000 hours, and it's supposed to result in potentially 2 pay raises in that time, uh, and potentially
Inside of
I
a
think
year and a
three
half?
2 years.
So inside of
So
2 years,
you
so 1
start,
basically a
you get
year.
one bump after a year, and then a bump probably as
Gotcha.
you're continuing. Not totally sure of what the schedule is, but that being said, you know, Your program's what, 18 months, 12 months?
I
But
think they
well,
go 51 weeks, and then, they're
51.
with me 12 more. Yeah,
Okay.
so they're
So
usually
yeah,
51
year and
weeks, and they're
change.
with me 12 more.
So
Yep.
figure 15 months. In 15 months time, in a formal training program, whether that's a, community college or even secondary, some high schools, but mostly
Mhm.
post-secondary technical schools, right? UTI, Lincoln Tech, Wyotech, all, all, all of those in that family. You're going to graduate with a large amount of factory certification in most of them.
Yeah,
You know,
there's a ton that are available, absolutely.
so you have to start to look at, well, side by side, for the apprenticeship to be attractive, it's immediately has to pay more, and it's not clear that that's the case. You can start in that apprenticeship at minimum wage. They don't specify what the wage bumps are. The other thing that's
Certainly.
interesting is you would think that would be 6,000 new people. It's actually 6,000 new apprentices, which means I could tag all of your students at UTI and call them apprentices.
Exactly.
So that's interesting because it's not really addressing the shortage issue.
The
So,
actual problem, yeah.
yeah, and,
That sounds like a government program.
well, you can't fault ASE. The federal government was giving out
No?
money, and they said 25 million, but what'll
Right.
remain to be seen
I mean,
is
overall, if it helps, that's great, you know? I mean, I'm behind it if it helps. That's the thing. It's like, what's the telos at the end? What's the end goal in the Aristotelian? What exactly happens, you know?
yeah, you need measurable outcomes, and the measurable outcome for this is how many people are in it, right? It's not so much how many new workers do we have and how long were they retained, right? There's some pay for performance, which means, the big payment comes 90 days in. They get another thousand, so that's $2,500. They get another $1,000 at the end of the 1 year period.
Full
So
apprenticeship.
yeah, but primarily would appear that it's going to benefit large dealer groups,
Mhm.
large independent groups that can enroll large numbers of apprentices and then qualify
Yes.
for that rebate. So yeah, it's a very interesting time, I think, for our trade. And you mentioned all the money gets thrown at it. Going back to what we're
Yeah.
trying to do with AvTech is we're not trying to throw more money at it. We're trying to fix some of the root cause issues,
Yes.
right? Because no matter how much
Yes.
money you throw at this, if you don't start addressing the root cause problems, you're just going to be having the same story for the next 50 years. And it's quite interesting. Like in the research, they were singing the same song back in 1972 that we're singing now. We don't have qualified people, and there's not enough people, and flat rate is no good, and it
Yeah.
goes on and
And I
on.
mean,
So
back to what you mentioned too about pay, like, entry level pay is flat. Like pay all around is flat. There's just stagnation people don't realize. Like if you go back and look at Eric Weinstein, he did a thing and he was on a couple different podcasts showing this Department of Labor statistics showing like GDP versus wages, over from 1970, which is interesting, but I'll go off the silver standard at that point. Like wages stayed flat this entire time. GDP is skyrocketed this entire time. So it's kind of strange. Like this came up on a podcast I just did that hasn't went out yet, but back back in the olden times, we'll call it the 70s, if a technician was flat rate, they got 50% of the customer pay door rate. That was their take. And now with all these other things that these places have to deal with, like insurances and EPA and all these other things and disposals, and each little thing creeps in and shoves another hand in the business owner's pocket. It's attorney fees, there's CPA fees. The technician's kind of stagnant at 25% now. There's a little unknown rule that's behind the counter there, where the service side, the management is told from dealer principals all the way down, like, hey, we really want to keep our top people at 25% of that door rate or less. So let's try to stick to that. It's kind of an unwritten rule, if you will, but it goes along with that same thing you're talking about in the beginning. If you just take 1675, we'll use the number that you came up with, he was telling me. If you take that number, you go get down to the street and you get a job still dealing with the general public, the gen pop, I call them, but you're at a Taco Bell or you're at a McDonald's and you're 15, and then you're there a month and they possibly give you 50 cents just to keep you because those are high stress level jobs. Inside of a year, you might make shift leader manager. All of a sudden, you're making $20 an hour, 22, 25, who knows? Like all of a sudden, you just skyrocketed hockey stick past what somebody might be making to work on some of the most complex stuff that's on the planet in certain cases. So there's definitely a huge disconnect in the industry when it comes to that, because if someone looks at that, a young person looks at that and goes, no thanks. Like you were saying, I
That's
don't want
right.
no part of that. I'll go
And that's
flip
why
hamburgers and then in 2 years I'll be a manager.
Robert, spot on. It's why are we not paying them more when they come in? Because we don't really have to, right? Because if somebody walks in off the street, right, and is willing to do that job for 16.50 an hour, it kind of undercuts the educational model too when you think about it, because now we spent 4 years educating these young people. If they're not making considerable money more, what does that do? What does that say about the educational process? Right. So I think
Yeah, it starts to eat away at the integrity that was put into it, the time, the effort, all those things start to kind of dwindle.
and the money, right? The investment on the
Hmm.
part of the student. But I mean, there's some schools now. We work with Mass Bay Community College as one of our pilot schools up in Massachusetts. Their program's free, right? So,
Hmm.
there's some models out there where it costs some money. There's some models out there where it's a little bit more affordable. But at the end of the day, it's still an investment in your time. And if you can't
Yeah.
move the needle, think about going back to that disappointment gap, how disappointed that student is, right? Or that young person is coming into the career. And here's what kills me, Robert. I have a lot of friends. I've worked with a lot of dealer owners over the years. Right. I don't know many dealer owners that are suffering. Right. And if any of them are listening, I'm sorry, but right, you're all
That's
doing
true.
okay. Right.
Yeah.
So from that perspective, we can afford to pay people more money, right? And that's not the onus of our organization. The onus of our organization is to make the career pathway better, right? If that helps
Exactly.
wages, great. Right. That's not our overall impetus, but I think it has to be a part of the messaging, because even according to dealers, NADA, they've hired a few different really big think tanks to go out and do some research on what does one lost technician cost. Over 100,000 for sure. 172.5 seems to be the big number that is thrown around for the loss of one technician. So, okay, well, most dealerships are short 3, right? So do the
Easily.
math on that, right? You're talking over $500,000 in lost revenue potential, which if you look at the profit behind that, guess what? That's more money than it would cost to double your entry wage for 3 people. Right? An annualized basis. Costs you about 90 grand if you doubled what they're making coming in. So I think no matter what the message is, no matter where the money is coming from, that is the number one walk away moment, is when, folks coming in the industry look at that, they can't pay the bills, they can't pay the school loans, they can't pay the tool truck, and they can't figure out how to put lunch in front of them you know, while they're at work.
Yeah, they walk out and they're immediately underwater.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I
So,
could see that.
yeah, so big problems to solve, but I think where we're headed as an organization is trying to develop ways and to encourage ways of addressing some of those root cause issues by improving the educational system for technicians, by improving the what I would call face validity of certification, which basically means, everybody in the industry right now has mixed feelings on the current certification model, right? Well, if that certification is supposed to command you more money, but 50% of the people don't think it's valuable, then what does it do? Right? It hurts the
Yeah.
signaling value of that certification. So how do you strengthen that? You provide an extra layer of validity, which would be performance based testing, which is something that I've spent the last several years of my life working with, actually a woman named Judy Hale, who, if you look her up, she wrote the book literally called Performance Based Certification. She's worked with Fortune 500 companies for the last 50 years. She's in the twilight of her career.
I
But just
gotcha.
a wealth of information and knowledge, who's helped us to really identify the components of what needs to be done to make our program legally defensible, valid, psychometrically sound, and not just be like, "Hey, come in and take this test." Right? These are they have as much rigor as what an ASE exam goes through to create, and they provide a level of what we would call fidelity, right, in testing, which
Exactly.
basically means, like, if you have to go and you have to do a brake job, right, how would you want to test someone? You'd want to see that they can do that work, and that's exactly
Yes,
what AVTECC is doing.
I
So
got you.
that's a big piece of it, and there are other pieces that will come out here over time that will continue to be enhancements. One of the things that I think is really, really important right now is there are not many independent voices for the technician. There's not many independent voices anymore for the profession, right? Now, Wrenchway, I wish those guys all the best. I was
Yeah,
actually fortunate to
Jay,
get my
Jay
yeah, Jay
Goinigan. Yeah,
and and the guys there and Mark and my data set for my dissertation came from. And they were actually purchased just about a week or so ago by ASE. So who's out there is the, sort of independent voice that's providing data, when you think about it, like,
yeah.
where are the
Well, there's
statistics?
very, very few.
Yeah. There's a guy who works for UTI, Mark Cossett. I don't know if you've met him yet, but he's a Ford instructor. He's tracked a lot of the data over time, and it's been getting harder and harder to find data on how many certified technicians there are, how many people are
Sure,
taking tests. So that's something that I see, especially with my research background, is providing some peer-reviewed research, that will complement the industry research that's out there, but also,
exactly.
make sure that it's sound from the perspective of how it's measured, so that the information is as good as it could possibly be.
Sure.
So I do see
So
that as a real organization as well.
out of those things that you were talking about, so I've tried to look up some of those numbers before, and you're right. It's an absolute nightmare trying to find any of that stuff on the internet. U.S. Department of Labor is like 2 years behind to find anything. Typically, you can't find anything on it. But to your model, so when this first came out, when I first seen AvTech, the very first thing without ever looking at it and on its face of it, I'm like, I'm not a fan. I don't know that much about it. I'm like, I want to refrain, right? So I'm looking at it, and in your head, you're asking yourself, like, the first question would be why. There's this giant place out there that's done this for literally forever. Then I find out about the hands-on component of it, and I'm like, okay, well, I'm a huge fan of trying to make sure that, like, what I teach, they know and understand how to do it. So I'm a huge Richard Feynman nut. Like, I
Yeah.
love Richard Feynman to death. Like, I remember as a kid actually watching the congressional hearings, the Rogers Commission talk about the Challenger disaster. I watched the Challenger disaster sitting in
Yeah.
third grade. So, like, I
That's
remember
the
all these things, but, like, and I had no idea who this guy was until later in life. And maybe 10 years ago, I start looking him up, and I find out that he coined this technique. I'm sure he's not the exact person that came up with it, but, like, he made it famous, which was basically, if you can't explain it simply, you don't know it. So I'm like, well, that makes a lot of sense. So it comes back to the same thing. So something that I try to do, I try to make my students teach me back what I taught them. And it's difficult for them, first off, because, oh, well, that throws the entire thing, into, like, it's backwards for them. They're not used to actually having to stand up, deliver, explain what it was that they found out. So I watched this and I'm like, you know what? I'm looking more into AvTech at that point. And I'm like, there's a huge gap when it comes to the test, the ASE, as opposed to the person that comes out of the ASE and what they can do. I get a question all the time from students: how long do you think it takes to be a master? How long can I be a master? And then I always explain to them, what do you consider a master is the first question. Secondly, I tell them about, hey, they say it takes 10,000 hours to master something. And I'm like, how long is 10,000? And they just kind of look at you, right? And I'm like, it's 4.8 years. At 40 hours a week, it's 4.8 years. So if you look at it that way, like, could you imagine if everybody taught in such a way where they made them show them back, you do understand it? And then I bring up the Princeton model, the Harvard model a long time ago. In order to pass a doctoral thesis, especially, but some of these were done in bachelor's, you had to sit on a stool and it was an oral exam. There was
Still,
three
you still have
people.
to do that.
Yeah, there's three people that ask you questions about all the things that you learned, and they don't expect that you're going to know every single thing, but they also expect that you can give back to them the things that you were taught in at least a coherent fashion and something that sounds like the truth, right, of what they actually learned. So, like, I'm a huge fan of that, and to be honest, that was one of the reasons why I would definitely want to have you on because, like you're stating, with the ASE, there's all this psychometric things that are, like, set here, but there's not a lot of things that are on the outcome side of it that sometimes helps because everyone's got a story. "Hey, I worked with this one guy that was a master tech, and he
Yeah.
had L1 and he couldn't diagnose a vacuum leak on an literally on an injector." Now that happened to me. That's a real story. And I would never say the guy's name because he's a great guy. But that happened. Like I hired that guy because A, I grew up with him, and B, hey, the guy's got all the cred. He has the street cred. But then when it comes into actual practice, it's just not there, you know? And I think that is a huge reason why a place like AVTECC definitely has and can get a real good foothold into the industry and definitely will help on the backside of the things that, you and I face and people face out there now when they're trying to instruct. And it's going to make for a better technician when they get to a dealer or a mom and pop or a chain store.
It certainly will. And a lot of times I think people perceive like, oh, well, it's anti one organization or the other. Like, I
Sure.
think that it's not. I think the challenge that there
No.
is right now is that educational testing in the United States has become a huge thing, more so here than probably in any other country. And that method of testing has been standardized testing, right? My kids go to school in January and June and take standardized multiple choice tests that are delivered on a computer. Is that an indication of what they actually learned during the course of the year? I don't think so.
Sadly, not a lot. That's
And
true.
is it an indication of what they can do? Probably not either. So, there's a couple things that I see that from an educational perspective, if you really want to see that someone's mastered something, you ask them to do it, right? And
Hmm.
people will also say
Yeah.
like, well, a performance test is not a cognitive test. And it's like, well, no, it actually is a cognitive test because you have to
Yeah.
assemble all those cognitive pieces that we were talking about before into a performance. You actually have to physically do it. So there's some research, educational research out there to support that, quite a bit of it. Some of that came to light like probably in the early 1990s in the medical field, where hospitals, medical programs were struggling to get skilled practitioners. And there's something called the Miller Pyramid. You can look that one up. That was, I think, from 1990 that talks about, okay, if you want to know something, there's that base level of knowledge, right? And at the top of that four level pyramid is the performance of that, right? And it's built on knowledge. So it's not to say that
Yeah.
you don't need knowledge to do that performance piece. You absolutely do. The big challenge has been up until recently, how technologically do you deliver performance based assessments at scale? And you're going to not just in our industry, but you're going to hear about this across many industries. Presented at a conference last year, competency
Hmm.
based education network, and I told them about what they were doing with the automotive world. And I had someone from a prominent, well known medical school come up to me
Hmm.
and say, "Could you show us how to do this in the medical field?" It was quite interesting in medical education. And the reason that you're seeing that is you talked about the psychometrics. When you talk about psychometrics, what most psychometricians are worried about is internal validity, right? Basically, when you talk about a test, the ability of that test to do what it says that it's going to do, and that's backed up by
Exactly.
statistics, right? Then you have external validity, which would be what do people on the outside think of whether or not that's valid, right? When you talk about threats to validity, right? Now more than ever, and this is where I was going with AI before,
Hmm.
it has become really easy for a student to go on ChatGPT or I don't know, pick one, right? And say,
Copilot. Yeah, Grok.
yeah,
There's all kinds of them now. Yep.
give me 100 questions on the A6 area. And then when we're done with that, give me 100 new ones, right? So all of a sudden, you know, what looks like you're going to take a certification exam. Let me help you with that. What do you
Hmm.
know about these technician A, technician B questions? Right. So one of the threats to validity is AI. Right. So the answer for that in the testing community is well, we just have to we perhaps have to have more test items. Right. So a test item would be all right, you've got, these 42 different tasks. The whole purpose of building that job task analysis was to build your exam. Right. So
Hmm.
those items become now you're writing test questions typically tracked back to an item, and then you have a percentage of those items distributed throughout the test. Well, if you have issues with test security, cheating, right, which there's
Yeah.
probably not too much of in our industry on the in person proctored exams, but we now have longitudinal recertifications that we
Yes.
can screenshot.
Yep.
So if you start to
There's
understand how the test is put
there's
together,
there's some people that just have like photographic memories also. Like if some of the people that's in this industry way smarter than I am. They can just like kind of remember they got it right. They know they got it right, and they remember the question. So like loose lips, six ships, right? Like if they just tell a couple people that, and it does make it to the internet, because I mean all those things do is scrape the internet for info.
yeah, so that's a
You're
threat
right.
to
So
validity because now
yeah.
it is true that people that shouldn't pass the exam may pass for a reason like that,
Hmm.
right? And that's multiple choice testing, standardized testing across the board. So what do you do to improve the testing model? Well, you can add more test questions, right? But in our industry, all of those test questions have to be validated by subject matter experts. So now
Yes.
your cost of producing a single test goes through the roof. So
Sure.
you have choices. Stand pat. This is our model. This is what we're going to do. But in the meantime, the perceptions of what that exam can now effectively convey, and we call it signaling in the certification community, signaling what you're able to do, the perception of that goes down, right? And that's not a knock on testing organizations. That's a knock on where testing is today in the year 2026. So, how do you fix that? Well, you add more points of measurement, right? ASE early on, the question was, well, how do we know competent people are going to take this test? Well, you have a years of experience requirement, right?
Hmm.
So that's going to have to change. And one way that you do that is with a performance based exam, right?
Yes.
In addition to, or perhaps in place of, an ASE exam area. The way that we see them is doing those measurements in smaller increments, right? Because the other big issue from an educational perspective is most high school and college students can't pass an ASE exam,
No,
right?
I
Because
agree
if
with that.
they did, you've got 127,000 people in the pipeline every year that would be taking them. And over 5 years' time, let's just say half of them passed, you'd have 300,000 technicians in the certification system. Well, as of 2 years ago, you only had 200, no, yeah, somewhere around 270, maybe even be less than that. I think it was like 274,000, which is still a lot. So, no, students are not taking those exams or passing them in high numbers. We don't know how many because it's not published. And that is something that we need to see. We need transparency to know,
Yes.
where do we go?
What are what are people actually getting from it? That's exactly right.
Yeah. So from there, you say, well, if they're not all passing it, why? Right? It's because the content areas are too big, right? A certification exam
It's
traditionally was
it's
designed to
broad.
be this
It's true.
broad, overarching, we're going to test you on all of electrical, right? Well, now, go back to the 1972 conversation, right? And look at where we are today. Last year, I think there were 162 models of electric vehicle on them.
Sure.
Where on
I
earth
would
do you
believe that 100%.
and you're going to have a 50 to 60 item test that needs to be representative of a good portion of that electrical knowledge. So those are the challenges. So where we see certification testing coming in is at the secondary and post-secondary level as a starting point. And the reason for
Hmm.
that is you have a large number of people coming into the industry through schools. So if we start to address the pipeline and we start to implement this system within the schools, that becomes a logical way to progress to this is the pathway, right? And then also
Certainly.
differentiating. So, for example, right, in a high school, you might do basic electrical, you might do starting and charging systems. You're
Hmm.
probably not going to do network diagnostics. You may not even do body electrical, right?
They might talk about it. That's exactly right. Yeah, it might be introduced, but
And
not
they might not even
not actually
do,
studied.
right. They may not even do basic electrical and starting and charging systems a fair shake. So you start there and you say, look, cover this content as a building block. Don't
Yes.
go for the shotgun method where we're going to hit everything under the A6 area. Teach to mastery, right? At
Yes.
that level. From there, you have a building block to your post secondary where you now have real articulation, where those students coming into you at your program, right? Before, well, the preliminary program before they get to you with the BMW program, that's going to be a better student, right? In
Yes.
theory. I think also what will happen is that as you start to provide students with evidence of what they can do, that
Yes.
becomes a bigger piece than saying, well, I went through this master certified program and then having that disappointment. Instead, what you're saying to an
Exactly.
employer is, we tested that the student can, do a maintenance, do this, can do that, right? And they're going to be able to come in and their first day on the job, not that they're going to be masters, but they've at least done it and proved that they can do it. And maybe more importantly, also indicate the students that can't, so that we're not creating this false currency between the school and the employer. So
Exactly right.
that's kind of where we're living right now is perfecting that model for the school system, and we'll be rolling more of that out this year. We had 6 pilot schools that participated with us last year in performance-based certification,
Very
and the
nice.
feedback is awesome. The feedback is really cool. The students love it. We had a couple of advisory board meetings with, and interrupt me at any time. I know I'm talking a lot, Robert,
Sure. No, you're fine.
but we had a couple advisory
This is to
board meetings.
showcase you and AVTECC.
I love it, but I want to make sure that I'm getting to all those things that you want to get to too.
Oh yeah,
And this is
absolutely. That's
probably
no
a part
problem.
of it. But as you might imagine, we went up to Mass Bay Community College, and this was back in October. And we basically showcased what the certification process looks like in front of an audience of about probably 30 employers in the shop watching.
Okay.
At the end, there was a gentleman there who was he was actually the internal trainer for 26 New England area dealerships. And
Hmm.
so we said, "So what do you think?" And he said, "This is a game changer. Like, where has this been? Like, we know that schools are doing performance assessment, right?
Yes.
And I think the issue is it hasn't been standardized or valid. And when I say standardized or valid, has not gone through that ISO 17024 process or NCCA process, which are the processes for how do you build a legally defensible, valid, credible program that's quality. And I think it's because, go back to before. I walked in after 25 years as a technician, right? Like, my background was in test design, but I'm going to give a test. Is it representative of what they learned? Right. So this gives teachers a system that they can rely on. It's built in small chunks. And, to that employer's point, it's probably what we should have been doing all.
Certainly. Yeah, it definitely sounds like that. I mean, like you said, if you've got that many people and there's the feedback is really, really good. You mentioned something while you were talking about, students that actually are able to achieve something. And, it could be really something small in a program, but when you see them do things in small chunks like you're talking about, and then they can do it, like to watch a student actually that came into school, maybe like I've had students in the past that came from a community college and they hated it. It wasn't anything automotive, that didn't want to, they find out that they have to sit in a cubicle all day. And some people are not built like that. that he wanted to work with his hands, the one I'm particularly talking about. And basically comes into school and like he finds out really shortly, like, I really like this. This is a great thing that I'm learning here. And he like gets caught on fire for this type of stuff. And when you see that as an instructor, like there is no better feeling than that light bulb moment or seeing a student like actually want to learn things. And I think that the hands-on portion of this, like you're talking about, I think that helps a student immensely, especially, and like you're saying, you kind of have to get them a little younger because they still have a very plastic brain. Still, there's a lot of neuroplasticity that happens when they're young enough. Some people can train themselves throughout the 20s, 30s, and 40s to still have that divergency and be able to go off and like learn about all types of different things. But it's not for everybody. So getting the two at that, post secondary and definitely secondary school level is, I think, extremely important. And like I mentioned, that's why I wanted to have you on the program.
Yeah.
I think that the hands-on portion of it really is actually a game changer.
Yeah, we think so, and we think the industry is going to think so too. That has been for 50 years sort of the underlying piece. And again, it's not a knock on ASE. It was inherent to the design of the test, right? And I think other professions that use just a test as the measurement of the profession, right, have
Hmm.
realized that that's an incomplete measurement of whether somebody is. And we don't use the term competency necessarily in testing because you can't test competency. You can't test somebody's choice to be competent or incompetent. It's a choice. You can say I measured them against the standard, right, at a specific time, but yeah,
Exactly.
it's huge. And to go back to the whole piece with students, Robert, to me, that is the whole piece here, right? Like you're
Yes.
developing a progression that's stackable, right?
Yes.
That rewards at an early moment in time their ability to do something. And I think for a lot of our
Exactly.
students that come into automotive programs, and you probably will see this, they don't want to
Hmm.
be sitting in the classroom because that's not where they learn. They learn doing this. And it also doesn't mean that they're not good learners, like, and this
No,
would be
definitely
my
not.
argument, like from the content piece. Now with AI, if someone struggles with the English language and they see a relatively long description, right, in service information, there's nothing stopping them from going into ChatGPT
Yep.
or, whoever, Copilot,
Translate.
take this and say, can you condense this and communicate it to me like I don't know what I'm talking about and explain this to
Yeah.
me in very simplistic terms? And it will do it. So to us, content is really going to take a backseat in education to performance. Right. And I think you're
Hmm.
going to see that across multiple industries. And we're talking about it, right? You're hearing about skills based hiring, right? But going back to the students, they love it because it gives them that it's almost like a game, right? Like, all right,
Hmm.
what else can
Yeah.
I do? And those things
Yes,
stack up.
exactly.
Those successes continue to stack until they have something demonstrable. And then what's really cool
The
is
the
they can
horizon broadens for them.
100%. And they can then leave their institution with we issue their credentials through a digital badging system. So, and
Hmm.
that pushes immediately to something like a LinkedIn profile or social media. So for them, it becomes instant currency. It also becomes a way for employers to immediately validate because there's a QR code on there that they can scan and it pushes back to
Certainly.
whether that's a real certification or not, because that's become a thing, believe it or not.
Oh,
Uh,
yes. Yeah, I've heard some of the scams that's been happening. It's
yeah. So,
that is prevalent in the industry, not in our industry necessarily, but
yeah.
there's a news story a couple weeks back. There was a whole bunch of bachelor's degrees apparently that have been just completely fake. So I was like, oh, okay. See
Yeah.
how that
Unless
is.
Unless you have, yeah, and I know there's a national movement to kind of fix some of this, right? Like, you need like a national credential registry, and I know there's quite a bit of funding out there digging into that. But yeah, it just gets back to if we can give them a way to demonstrate the skills that they have, hopefully
Yes.
for them that leads to a better employment outcome,
Hmm.
but also allows an employer to make a decision and say, well, the reason I'm paying this young person that comes in minimum wage is because they haven't proven anything. And, you hear that from a lot of employers. And we say, well, why don't we do some of the proving before they get to you? That way,
Yeah,
make
that
that
that makes
decision.
total sense too.
They're
Like,
more
I mean,
valuable.
I've been on both sides. I've been on both sides of the counter, and if you're trying to interview somebody and they come in and they don't have anything to back up what they've done, it's very difficult for you to say yes. Because I was always trained, it's easier to fire somebody before you ever hire them. That's Dave Anderson training. Learn to lead stuff from a long time ago when I was at Jag and Rover. Like that's true. Like it's sometimes hard to get rid of the person that's not actually going to perform. So it goes back to that. But I think I'll ask you this one last thing because I think in my mind, this has got a couple ways it can go. And one of them, I just ask you this way: how does it scale? How can you scale it? Because to me, it looks like a multiplication problem. Because now you need additional people that are trained that can stand somewhere and watch somebody perform what it is that they're supposed to perform. So really, this is a good thing for those who are in the education industry, especially for automotive, because it does seem like it would create jobs and they're important jobs. So it's like, how does it scale? What do you see for its future?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, the schools are a logical starting point. We also
Certainly,
see the schools eventually as partners, much in the way that ASE partnered with schools years ago, to
certainly.
be the providers in their communities for in-person performance-based testing. There is also now with technology the ability to do some of this without bringing people into a testing center. So as that technology continues to advance, there will be ways that we can offer this that are quite scalable that were not possible maybe even 3 or 4 years ago. So that's
Much
a
like
big part of
lecturing.
our.
Like you can lecture to one person, or now you can lecture to millions of people with the technology. Makes
That's
total
right.
sense.
Yeah. So to give you a little bit of an idea, in the medical field, they've had something for years called OSCEs, and I forget what the acronym is, but more or less what it is, it's a video camera that is in the operating room, and it's looking at what a veterinarian or medical professional might be doing in a particular procedure. It's recorded, it's judged, and it's proctored. So
Sure. So it's a
that,
chest and a Metacam.
yeah. So over
Yeah, I
time,
see that. Yep.
there it's very scalable, and it's something that phase one for us is the school system, secondary,
Hmm.
post-secondary technical schools. Phase two is helping those school systems create partnerships within their community. And then the third will be probably over time a defined system of professionalism where essentially anybody can participate, but it has more points of measurement. And I'm not going to go into any great detail because
Certainly.
I don't want to kill the lead, and I'll leave a little up to the
No, that's
imagination. But
totally fine.
it is it is something that I've given much thought, research, and things that we've structured and sorted out. The challenge for us is we didn't have a $7 million benefactor, right? So
Yeah.
it's slow. It's going to take some time.
Yes.
We would greatly encourage folks in the industry that might listen to this that say, "Hey, this sounds interesting," to get involved, and there's a variety of ways that we can work with different organizations. We do have a couple of corporate sponsors. We do some work with Pico Technology, with
Sure.
Top Don,
Yep.
Electude that does some educational software, and
Yep.
some others that
Familiar
are,
with all three.
yeah, that are in the pipeline. And yeah, just excited for what the future holds. I think you know anytime you change, right? Like anything, right? And this goes back to
Yes.
psychology. You don't change until the pain of the current situation gets to the point where the actual change itself is probably less painful, right? And
Exactly.
I think we're heading there. You've probably seen recently in the news. There's a lot of legislation that's been floated in multiple states around ADAS, and the idea of licensing has come back up. And
Yeah.
how does an
And
ADAS
certain
technician,
equipment.
how do you assure that people can do the work, right? And we're
Hmm.
back kind of to 1972 all over again, where if that pain point ramps up, I think you'll see the proliferation of AVTECC, right? If it doesn't, we'll see. And I've always said, as I've set out to do this, my goal is to change the industry in a
Yeah.
meaningful way and to change those root cause problems. If I change the root cause problems and AVTECC isn't around anymore, that's okay, right? If that becomes something, but I don't see that happening. I think that there are enough people in this industry that have seen enough that say
Sure.
change can't be as bad as what we're experiencing right now. And not that it's
Yeah.
that bad, like, right? We grew up in this career, it's been good to us. But I think for
Yeah. It's
this next
always
generation,
put a roof over my head and food in my stomach. Always. So
absolutely. But I think we're also in the minority, Robert. I think there are a lot of people that get those 2, 3 years in and say, you know what, I've seen enough. This is not for me. And it's not because they don't like cars, right? And it's not because they want to do this. It's because the system in which they've been brought up to become a professional has not really been a professional system. And if we can change that, I'd be a happy man.
yeah. Sometimes I've likened it to a wicked mistress is how I say it sometimes. So sometimes it's wonderful, sometimes it is not great at all.
Yeah.
But like you said, it's always been like it really was in my blood. Like I couldn't get away from it. Like I did try, full disclosure, I tried to leave the industry 2 times. I went and sold insurance for 6 months and Obamacare was passed. So that shot that right
You
down.
bet.
I was like, "Oh, I'm back. I'm coming back." And I also went and I done HVAC work for about 6 months for a guy for residential and commercial and new build and, just buildings and going to check and stuff out, mostly on the diagnostic side. But that was not what I wanted to do. Like I couldn't do that. And I just left and I ended up back doing technician work again. So yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, it's one of those things where what do they always say to you? It's like being in a bucket of crabs. I tried to get out, but they just pulled me right back in.
Yeah. I didn't mention this at the beginning of our conversation, but when I was done with high school, I was working at that gas station, and my parents and my parents were divorced at the time, and my grandfather was a real role model in my life around the automotive space. I said to him, "What do you mean after high school? I'm doing it. I work in a shop." And both he and the gentleman that I worked for at the time sat me down on the curb at a Texaco gas station that had a 3-bay repair shop. And I remember John Bryant, unfortunately, he's since passed, was another mentor. He said
Yeah.
to me, "David, son, you are not going into this business."
Yeah.
And I was like, "What?"
Yeah. What do you mean? What have I been doing here this entire time?
And my grandfather was with him at the time. And that became one of those foundational pieces to this AvTech puzzle, that why, right, would two successful men in this industry tell a young person not to go into it? And, my grandfather, I can remember him telling me, this business is so hard. There is no real professional pathway. It's not clear what it is. Yeah, you can take some tests or you maybe go work for a manufacturer, but it is tough. I see it every day. He was
Yeah.
walking into dealerships, into repair facilities, and those repair facilities were I mean, surviving on the information that he was providing them on a weekly basis. And that it was
Certainly.
back in the early 90s when diagnostics were just starting, you
Yeah, it
know.
was taking
Kind of
off. That's when
Yeah.
I started in the industry was like 92 to 93, somewhere in that neighborhood.
Yeah, I was 12 in 1992, and I was on the back of the Snap-on tech truck with my grandfather, Ray, and we were going into shops, and he was showing them how to use the scan tool, and he had me at 12 years old under the hood saying, "All right, this is a GM, so get the GM adapter. That GM adapter
Yeah.
is over here. All right, this one's a Ford. All right, this one needs a cigarette lighter connect." Right?
Yep.
Uh, that's where I
The
started
Snap-on
learning.
MT2500 brick, the red brick. Yeah, it's the first one I ever used.
But he had
The
an up
12
close.
pin GM.
Yeah, exactly. and
I
he
could
had
go
an
on
up
and on
close
about that
view.
stuff forever.
Classic. He had the counselor scope,
Yeah.
counselor
Yep. I remember
2.
the counselor. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
showing
got to
us
use
gray and raster
the
on a
Sun.
secondary emission.
Yeah, the old Sun
Son.
machines. That one of the places I worked at had one of those, had the vacuum gauge on it and the whole 9 yards. It was the diagnostic, the wall that you rolled up to the car.
Yeah,
So
he had,
I got to cut my teeth on the cathode ray, type tube setup
yeah.
for the
Yeah, those
secondary primary ignition. I love that thing. It was
that
great.
it was an awesome tool, right? That was
Oh
like
yeah.
those days, the picoscope of then, It was like, wow,
Yeah.
look what
And
you
it
can
was
do with this.
live. Like this DSO stuff is all great and it gets filtered a lot and all these things, but like you could really watch like what was happening with that cathode ray.
Yeah,
And it was, if you were really, really good with it, I mean, you were great with that tool. So you could fix
it's
just about
amazing.
anything with that thing.
Oh, there's no doubt. And I think that was what was so confusing to me is
Yeah.
my grandfather was not a rich man, right? He was a middle income, average guy, raised a family, small house that he bought in the 50s, had a service station in the 50s and 60s,
Yeah.
but made a living for himself. And to have him as, probably one of the most important mentors in my life at that time tell me not to go into this business,
Right. Had to be confusing.
especially, yeah. And then going into education and thinking, am I telling these students the right way to go? Because it's contrary to what grandpa told me, right? That to me is like when I went back to the beginning of our conversation, sort of that moral imperative that I feel to provide service to our industry, to fix root cause problems so that when we have conversations with young people, we say, you're getting into a great business. That's a profession that's going to be able to sustain you and your family. There's going to be a
Yeah.
lot of different pathways, right? And I think, a lot of the industry information about salary, I battled this in my dissertation, right? It's 4,000 people on LinkedIn filled out the salary survey. So it looks like the salary is 80,000 a year, right? But in reality, those 4,000 people are not the population. And what I mean by that
Right.
is that's not a random sample of our industry. Random
Exactly.
sample of our industry is probably closer, and I know some of the industry will push back on this. It's closer to what the Bureau of Labor Statistics says, which is still under 50 grand a year, and
Yes.
that's the median number. So in a population of 800,000, that means 400,000 people make less than 50 grand a year. That's an
Yes.
accurate number as far as I'm concerned.
Yep.
So
That's what
how
I've
do
read. I 100% agree with that.
And that's my imperative is help the people that want to make this a profession to have the tools to do it, to have the education they need, to have the credentials. And I think ASC is a part of that. I mean, I don't discount the fact that that provides you a recognition in terms of you committed your time to do that. You had to prepare and take that test. And now
Yeah.
with an enhancement to that with performance-based certification and then looking at a model for lifelong learning, I think we can give technicians the profession they deserve.
Yeah. I think with any evolution also, like you were saying earlier about, how complex the vehicles have gotten over the years, I think that, at one time, ASE was really all you kind of needed and really probably not so. I mean, it probably should have been a hands-on component a little earlier, but now it's like if you're unleashing somebody to go work on these $100,000, rolling robot server farms that you have them working on, like, why isn't it smart to have them pass something where you can a performance based test, like you're saying, like you'd see them work on the vehicle. You can watch that they know the steps to take. Because honestly, some of this stuff is built to a level of if you do one wrong move, something lets the magic smoke out of it
That's
and then
right.
it doesn't work any longer. So I think it's actually if you just go to like a lean Six Sigma mindset, it's smarter to teach them how to do it correctly now than have to train them later and push off the hands-on assessment component of it.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot to unpack there too. I think feasibility, like I said, even 5 years ago, feasibility, maybe not. Now it's feasible, right? So that's part one. the other thing is, ASC's been around for a long time and they have an established business model. They have an organization. There are people there with salaries. So making changes to an organization where you're starting to make changes to your revenue drivers is not an easy decision, right? And regardless of what it is, right? That first and foremost, right? It's a program for technicians, but it's still there's still a business model there. So like it's
Yes.
very difficult to say, you know what, we're not going to offer this test, and this test anymore because there are implications for that. So yeah, how does that roll out over time? It has to be a different model. And I think that's the thing that it's challenge, right? Because do you do both cognitive assessment and hands-on? Because then that's costly for technicians. So it needs to kind of meld to
Yes.
where, there's a way to say, maybe a cognitive assessment that's generalized in one of these areas isn't the right approach. Maybe that's a
Right.
performance-based assessment. Maybe the cognitive
Again,
piece makes sense in other areas, right? So it's going to take some figuring out
exactly.
of what that looks like long term, but I see those things happening over time.
One of the things that comes in my mind is when you're talking about this stuff too, is like sometimes businesses get so large. I'm a huge fan of Peter F. Drucker as well. And Drucker was an amazing guy that was a consultant years ago. Businesses, IBM, NASA, like he's been all over the place. Of course, he's passed on now, but there's a ton of books that he left behind. One of them I read a long time ago is The Effective Executive. And, one of his main sayings was first things first and second things never. So, like, sometimes the places get so large that they can't make a decision because it's like it's Soviet rule, like committee, all ruled by committee. And you can't be agile when a business necessarily runs that way every single time. So it's probably one of those things where, in my mind, maybe ASC has kind of come along this entire time, and maybe people were brought up the fact, hey, we should probably do hands-on assessment. Because to be quite honest, when I went to I was going to do L1 years ago, and I never even looked into it deep enough apparently, but I thought when you took an advanced test, it was like a GM ASA. It was, you take the test, someone stands by you and they watch you do the car. Car's bugged, you check it out. You have to find out what's wrong with it. So,
Right.
out of fear and not having the need it, I didn't need it to have to work in the industry. I'm like, no big deal. So I finally get it while I'm a tech. But back to the thing, it's like, is the place too large at the top to like not, the right hand doesn't know what the left hand's doing, or it's tough to become innovative and agile to change in direction.
Yeah. And that's what I see as an advantage of AVTECC, right? Is that we're
Yes.
new.
Yes.
We don't have a business model that we have to pay attention to. We just have to do this the way that is going to be right for
Built
technicians, that works
built
for
on
us.
outcomes.
It's built on outcomes, right?
Right.
And it'd be nice to have the bankroll. I'll tell you that.
Yeah.
But from the perspective of starting a new organization, right? There are some efficiencies for new organizations where you can be innovative and you can do things a
Certainly.
whole lot faster than existing organizations. That's for any business. That has nothing to do with
Yes.
current
Yeah. Among
situations as they
among
be.
all industries, you're 100% accurate. I
Yeah.
mean, at
So
one time there was a Blockbuster, and then there was a Netflix. You know.
yeah. Well,
So
there's
yeah,
that
you're
famous
100%
conversation, right, about Netflix and
right.
Netflix was totally. I don't know if you've ever heard this. Reed Hastings and I forget who the other exec there was. I forget his name. Give an interview, and they were totally upside down. They were like $50 million in debt or something like that,
I could believe it.
and they
Some
were
places
sending
operate that way.
yeah, and they were sending DVDs out. So they had a
Yep.
corporate retreat, and they went to California. They were all
Uh huh.
there in their like Hawaiian shirts and shorts. They're at the beach
Sure.
and they get a phone call. I don't know if you've heard this story, but it's pretty
I've
interesting.
not.
They get a call from Blockbuster, and it
Okay.
was the call that apparently they'd been waiting for. The Blockbuster exec said, "We'd like to see you." They're like, "Oh, okay, well, we're out here on the West Coast." They're like, "No, we'd like to see you tomorrow."
Right.
So the two of them get on a private jet, rent a private jet, which they don't have money for.
Hmm.
They walk into Blockbuster, and Blockbuster says, "Oh, you're this hotshot new and up and coming company. It's pretty interesting." They're like, Yeah, and so they presented the blockbuster and they said, well, what we see here is like, you guys can continue to have your stores. And what we'll do is deliver this, mail model for you, eventually this digital model, which I don't think the digital model was even a thing then yet.
No, no, it
So,
definitely started as like mail order.
so Blockbuster says to Reed Hastings and the other executive, they said, so what's the bottom line here? So they had already determined they just wanted out. They said, well, we'll sell you Netflix for $50 million.
Sure, just make it a zero, walk away.
The Blockbuster execs laughed at them and they said, that's funny. And you know how the story goes, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I
So,
use Netflix now instead of Blockbuster. You're exactly right.
so yeah, it's business world is funny. Where we wind up, I think I'll be pleasantly surprised, perhaps in either direction. But I think what we have right is the model, and I think having that and having that commitment to the industry. The other thing that's our advantage is, you know, when the automotive industry wanted to go out and design a they
Mhm.
had to go to educational testing services and probably other consultants. And that was that $7 million in expenditure for the first 7 years because the automotive executives did not know how to design a test program. The difference with AVTECC is I'm the guy that they paid the $7 million to. So
Yeah.
I've been able to create all of this without having the investment. And now we just need to bring it
Yep.
to scale.
Yeah. That's exactly right. Well, I'm sold. Where do I sign up at?
Let's do it.
I think
Well, when we're
yeah,
ready,
I think that's
we'll get you set up as a proctor, and we'll start getting your students certified too.
exactly. So that's probably a pretty good place to wrap it up. I really appreciate you coming on. I definitely want to do it again someday. I typically go a couple months, maybe 3, maybe 6, and then have you back on just to get a little touch in and find out, how it's going and how you guys have progressed.
That'd be
Does that sound
awesome.
like something you guys want to do?
Absolutely, I appreciate the opportunity and
Wonderful.
appreciate what you're doing with the podcast, and glad to be a
Sure.
part of it.
Drop a couple plugs. Make sure you throw your YouTube in here. It's avtech.org. It's AVTECC.org. And
That's
then
right.
what's the YouTube channel? Is it the same
YouTube
name?
channel is also AVTECC.
Perfect. So you made it
Sure.
easy for everybody to find it.
Tried.